Thank you everybody for tuning in, and thank you everybody for the birthday wishes in the chat. This is a way to spend my birthday that I'm very excited about. These Zoom events, as those who have joined in the past know, are always very near and dear to my heart in terms of the conversations. So like always, we'll try to make this one a very candid discussion with a lot of back and forth and engagement. So just to give a high level overview of what we'll cover today, we'll start off just with a conversation with Prakash and I. So we have some questions that both of us have thought through, but we really do want to make the conversation more of a discussion and a dialogue. So throughout the conversation, really do feel free to raise your virtual hand. That's the best way to signal to us that you're interested in asking a question. So feel free to raise your virtual hand, type questions in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable doing. For those that are comfortable turning their video on, especially when you post question, always great in terms of just the engagement. But of course, if you prefer not, that's fine as well. So with that, just wanted to share, and then as always, we'll leave a lot of time for live Q&A at the end, and then I'll wrap up with what I call office hours. So if people have questions unrelated to what the topic is today, and they just want to pick my brain on something, I'll try and leave as much time as possible after the hour has passed to just talk through some of those things. So with that, just wanted to begin the conversation by talking through what is meant by choosing the predictable path versus creating your own path, because this is one of the things that in the questions and the conversations that I was having was a common thing that popped up in terms of especially what was meant by choosing your predictable path. So the way I like to think about it, when I graduated from college, two of my close friends, actually, they were roommates, both lived across the hall from me. One of them went to Morgan Stanley and has stayed there ever since. One of them went to BCG and has stayed there ever since. And the one who's at Morgan Stanley is a vice president at this point, on the verge of being an executive director. The one who went to BCG is already a partner at this point. And it leads to this discussion that I know a lot of people, that I've thought a lot about, and I feel like I've also had with many of my peers, which is around going to an organization, staying in the seat that you're in and just climbing a ladder, so to say, versus taking a step back and feeling a little bit more comfortable or okay with zigzagging. So I wanted to set that as context. I feel as though myself personally, I've taken much more of a creating your own path type of approach. And that's because I've bounced around at Morgan Stanley. So starting out in the investment banking side, then moving to sales and trading side, then joining a multicultural client strategy team, which was basically a startup within Morgan Stanley, trying to focus on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients, then a role within talent management. So I don't think that these roles were necessarily moving up any sort of ladder. A lot of these felt like horizontal moves, which can be uncomfortable at some times, because then when you look at your peers, you see that you can feel like they're getting ahead versus when you're zigzagging and going horizontally. It can be a path that leads to a lot of insecurity and challenges in that sense. So, and then I went and worked for an educational company in China for a summer. I went and got my MBA and then worked as a research associate for a bit, then went to BCG, and starting off in a path that would have been predictable had I stayed in that track. But after a few years, deciding, no, I actually want to pivot and do something that's a little bit more off the beat, but closer connected to what I'm interested in, took on this role as the design manager for our Leadership Institute, which is basically an executive education offering for our Asia Pacific based senior executive clients. So I share all that to say that we'll dive into this a lot more in the conversation, but this is how I've kind of thought through it, maybe initially in my own life and so forth. And so, Prakash, I'd love to kind of bring you in. Thank you so much for joining for this conversation. Just for context, Prakash and I were connected through somebody that Prakash overlapped at Kellogg with. They were on campus at the same time, a good friend of his, who's also been a tremendous mentor of mine. He's head of the Washington, D.C. office for BCG, and he's been just a beacon of support and strength throughout my time at BCG and when I was recruiting for it. So he had put the two of us in touch. And since then, I've had many great conversations with Prakash. So thank you so much for doing this, and would love to kick things off so that you can provide a little bit of background and context in terms of who you are and some of the experiences. Would love to hear how you've thought through creating your own path and some of the experiences that you've had to date, and the extent to how deliberate that planning was and so forth might be a great place for us to open this conversation.
Yeah, it sounds great. I say we open with a happy birthday to you. happy belated, I guess, in Singapore. But thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the time that we spent together, and I'm excited to be here. Um, this is a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart. I think there are a lot of people, particularly who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to talk with folks about this, like is actually getting a perspective on what it means to create your own path. And so maybe just as background of sort of, or at least my career background, I have done a lot of zigging and zagging. So I grew up in Texas, and I think Mahak here went to Rice as well. I went to Rice. I was a tennis player. I had the chance to play around the world as a junior, and played at Rice. And when it came time for jobs during the summers, my first job, I think after my freshman year, was an SAT instructor, and that was fun. And then my second summer, I ended up working at a startup renewable energy company that was based in Morocco, which was super cool. I was going to France because I had, sort of gotten injured, and I was like, well, this would be a great opportunity to do something that seems like new and a really cool culture. And did that, loved it. I will say I didn't have the courage to stick with that. So I ended up, through very, very good fortune, being a part of the SEO program, which some of you may have been a part of. I know, Tristan, you were. And and through there, I ended up at Merrill Lynch for their analyst program. And it was fine. I wasn't like, oh my God, I really don't like this or anything. But I was like, this is just really not necessarily for me. And then I actually went and worked at SEO for 4 years, which was probably outside of doing my own thing, the best experience I've had, because it dealt with a group of people I really, really loved and wanted to impact. And but that said, I was in New York City making not a whole lot of money, and all my buddies were in banking or private equity or hedge funds or something like that. So they want to go to the nice places. And I'm like, I can't afford that. So I started a side business at that time, consulting people and getting into college to make some extra money. But I realized, I loved what I was doing at SEO, but financially, it wasn't in line with perhaps like where I really wanted to be. And I think, at my age now, I would say I would love to think I was more mindful about it, but basically, I think I was anchored on what you make in banking. And so I ended up going to business school. I was at Kellogg. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to go back to a bank. I thought about consulting firms, but it seemed like I would be having some similar experience of sorts as I did at the bank. So I was like, well, maybe I'll go into brand. And I did that. And if you had asked me while I was doing that, I'd say I really didn't like it at all. And so, I ended up leaving there largely, or I left there and I moved from New York to San Francisco. I ended up at a young startup that had just received some good funding. We were doing okay for a while, and then we just totally failed. So I was the last employee there. And then it was at that time I was like, well, maybe I'll say, I think a question that you asked, Tristan, was like, how deliberate was I? And I'm going to say not in the least bit. Or, I would like to think that I was, and I think for the time, maybe I was. For example, I think when I left Merrill to go to SEO, I knew intuitively that there was a certain type of work that I wanted to do, and it wasn't at the bank, and I couldn't see myself as my boss, my boss's boss's boss, my boss. I couldn't see myself as anyone up that chain. There was nothing against them. It was just that was not who I was. Now I couldn't rationally explain that, but it then led me to SEO, which also said, hey, this is a lot of who I am, And I think something I value is financial independence. And so I want to look at something different. And I went into brand because I was like, I like business. I see you run businesses there, and it's financially better than a nonprofit. So I would say to a degree it was deliberate, but the reality is like I think if I'm being like very honest with myself, it wasn't massively deliberate. I think it was more intuitive. And I wish, I think if I had said, hey, uh, what would I do if I were if I were back at 24, 25, 27, 31, whatever, I would say, oh, hey, look, like it would be useful for me to do some reflection. That reflection that I was doing at the time was more journaling, but it wasn't real reflection on like, who am I? What is my inherent nature? And what I mean by that is I grew up spending most of my summers in India until I was 13. And my grandfather was a physician who helped a lot of like community in India. And he was incredibly empathetic, helped a lot of people who otherwise didn't have money. My mother was a teacher who had a lot of empathy, but also held people accountable for what their contribution was in there. My dad was a marathoner, and so was highly disciplined. And like some of that is basically who I was, right? A lot of those characteristics were who I was, and I was instead thinking about what looks good, what should I do. I think I kept asking, what should I do? And I wish I had asked myself a little bit more like, what is my inherent nature, and what does that mean I'd want to do? And then can I get paid, and can it meet sort of like some set of values that I have.
Mhm.
And then after that startup, I said, I really want I need to do a little bit more deep work. So I did some values work on my own. What are my values? What do I feel like doing? If I did these exercises, like if I look at every single one of my past jobs, what did I like? What did I not like? And of those things that I didn't like, is it because I wasn't good at them, or did I not like them because I really tried and I was like, it's just not interesting to me? Who did I enjoy being around, and who did I not enjoy being around? And it just kept coming back to, I really enjoyed being around people who were highly, highly motivated, disciplined. And the types of work I liked doing was helping people get from A to B. So whether it was a skill or whether it was, how do you help someone feel really rooted in who they are, even if they're meeting with people who look nothing like them, that have totally different backgrounds and are more senior, and all these sort of things that create a lot of fear in us. Like, how do you help someone feel confident in who they are and how they operate? Um, and so I said, I want to. It sounds like some coaching stuff. I didn't really know what that meant, but in good fortune, I went to LinkedIn, and it just so happened that there was a guy who was coaching our CEO Jeff, and I beelined for him and said, "Hey, I'd love to be my own version of yourself, and will you take me under your wing? You can fire me in 90 days if you don't like me, but if you do, like, I'd really love you to coach me. I'd love you to observe coaching of mine, and by the end of our time together, I'd like to be coaching the executive team." And in good fortune, that came true. So we spent a little under 5 years together, and that path sort of worked. I left LinkedIn about 3.5 years ago, coaching a lot of the exec team and some other folks. But the beauty of that experience was I got to coach very early on some individual contributors and managers, and then I went to like some directors and VPs, and then eventually some of the exec team. And so I got to see a wide spectrum of the types of things an individual contributor is dealing with versus a CTO, let's say. And since then, I've been off my own, and I do a lot of coaching for CEOs of later stage startups, and then C-suite of larger public companies. And so, that part was deliberate. And we could talk a little bit about what I mean by deliberate, but that part was much more deliberate. But it started with me taking ownership on like, what did I want? who am I? And then saying like, how do I get the world to fit around that?
There's one aspect that you touched on, which I'd love to double click, and it's around external pressure and the role that external
Yeah,
pressure plays. And you touched on this at a few stages in the journey. One stage of the journey was speaking about, your experience at SEO, where you're working for this nonprofit organization, whereas you have friends that are in at hedge funds and private equity funds, and there's a financial pressure to
yeah,
kind of where you might be asking yourself, am I making enough? I could be earning more. What role should that play in the decision making? Then you also mentioned another point where you spend time, you feel as though when you reflect back, maybe you spent too much time thinking about what should I do versus you touched on reflection and the importance of reflection and really thinking about reframing that more to be around what you want to do as opposed to what you should do. So I guess if you think about the role that pressure has played, external pressure in particular, how
yeah.
have you started to manage that and make sense of that external pressure as you've navigated all of these stages and where you are now today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd love to ask you the same on sort of how you've navigated that for your career. I'll say maybe to step back. If you think about this, everybody here is like, successful, went to good schools, working at good companies, doing well. Um, here's here's I think what's pretty true. When you grow up, oftentimes for many of us, not everyone, but for many of us, it's like get good grades, right? So there's an outcome. Then it's like get into the good college, another outcome. Then it's get the good job, the Morgan Stanley job you got, right? Then it's like, no, 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 now get into a great business school. Um, and if you think about it, we are conditioned by a set of outcomes. Think about this: when you're in school, you raise your hand, you answer a question, you're either right or wrong, right? It's very outcome based. So the thing is, ultimately, you get conditioned to think that your worth, your self worth, and I don't mean this in some abstract woo woo way. I mean like your own esteem, what you believe in yourself, your self efficacy, is literally based on a set of outcomes. And if you think about those set of outcomes, you going to Wharton or HBS is not in. You can influence it, Tristan, but it is out of your control. You have no clue what side of the bed that admissions officer woke up on looking at your file. And so I think the reason I point that out is, um, by the way, that the last thing I'll say about that is then you get into these jobs with a peer set, right? Peer set of people at your Morgan Stanleys, your BCGs. Now, all of these people are hungry. All of these people have been conditioned by the same thing. And so when I was at the nonprofit and what I said, all my hedge fund friends and everything, it's because what I'm telling you right there is I had a view of what success looked like, and it was based on a blueprint that we've been conditioned to have. I don't mean that as a criticism of that blueprint. I just mean that, that pressure, that external pressure of outcomes, the value in it is that you do strive for something. You strive for a goal. It's good. The downside of it is that when we take that goal to be our worth, right, and we let the external dictate us. And I don't mean that in an abstract way. I really mean that as like, if I, for example, I got to go be in banking. Why? Because that's what we do. If I let that drive me, just think about this from a probabilities perspective. What are the probabilities that I'm going to be happy, that I'm going to feel fulfilled? Unless I am just good fortune that it happens to line up, maybe. But otherwise, I would bet on yourself, on being able to understand like who you are and what you value. Um, by the way, one of my best friends in the whole world, COO of a hedge fund, and he loves every ounce of it. And he is his reflection. He knows who he is. He knows what he values, and he values everything that stands for. Fair enough. That's how he rolls. But I think those external pressures, I wouldn't look at them as bad. I would simply accept that those are there. just accept that those are there. Tristan, you're at BCG, you just took on a new role, and yeah, it probably feels a little strange being in a different role from your HBS peer set, that's striving for the next promotion at BCG. So, I'd love to hear sort of where external pressure has played
Yeah.
in your career, and maybe if it aligns with some of what I'm saying.
Definitely aligns from my perspective. And I think that I wish I could say it was a learning experience in the sense that the pressure existed at one stage in my career. And then I kind of had this reflective experience and realized I shouldn't be motivated by the external pressure. And then it was done and I've kind of moved on. But what I've found is the more realistic way that it has looked for me is the pressure kind of keeps reintroducing itself. And even though I have tried to put a lot of practices in place to really be reflective, on a daily basis, on a quarterly basis, yearly basis, and so forth, it's almost as though I still sometimes, when you go into that new environment, I'm just trying to adjust and I forget what I've learned about external pressure and so forth. So I would say, when I was in investment banking right out of college as an analyst, that was probably the least happy year or so of my life, was that first year in investment banking. And even though I was feeling from an external perspective that I was checking all of the boxes, I knew in my gut that I needed to get out of that as quickly as possible. Ultimately made that pivot over to sales and so forth, and then started to realize, and then after a handful of years at Morgan Stanley, I think I had the experience that you talked about, where I looked up at some of the more senior people at the organization and asked myself, do I feel like the lives that they've lived are ones that would leave me feeling reflective when I get to their stage? And it was too few occurrences for me to say, okay, this is the right path for me to stay on. So I did have that period where I was like, okay, I'm going to step away from Morgan Stanley, even though from a compensation perspective, it's going to mean making a lot less money. Now, for me, I guess the context that's always really important is, as a first generation college student, my first year out of college, I already made more money in that first year than what would be the family expectation for somebody who's well into their career. So I guess I didn't feel like I had to necessarily keep up with other people, and that I think gave me a little bit more comfort and so forth. And then realizing over time that from a compensation perspective, regardless of the decisions that I make, and this is something that a handful of mentors of mine that have worked in the nonprofit space, the founder of MLT, who's a close mentor of mine, and in having some of these conversations, what I'm reminded of is, even if I chose to go into the nonprofit space, I, given the fortunate experiences that I've had, meaning the academic institutions, the Morgan Stanley, the BCG, even if I go into the nonprofit space, I'm going to end up in a leadership role within the context of that nonprofit space, which means in that I'm going to make more money than I actually need. And I think that realization of, okay, all of these numbers are more than I actually need has allowed me to take a step back and say, okay, now we can kind of move money off of the table. And that doesn't mean that I never have, I don't have to work. It just means that, like, I don't have to let that be the primary driver. And so that was kind of a lesson that I felt like I learned, very clearly at Morgan Stanley. And then I go to business school and, I come back to BCG, and there is a little bit of needing to remind myself of that lesson, almost as though I had forgotten it, because now again, I'm at BCG and I'm looking at what the people, one promotion, two promotion, three promotions ahead of me are earning, and saying, okay, I could do that if I chose to do that. But again, the path wasn't necessarily feeling right. And I'd say where the learning came in is, the first time around, it took me maybe 5 years at Morgan Stanley to say, okay, a pivot needs to take place so that I'm doing something that that feels a little bit more meaningful. At BCG, I'd say that pivot came within a 1 to 2 years of saying, okay, let me make that pivot.
Let me ask them, because so first of all, when you said I make more money than I need, it's interesting, right? Because the assumption we would all have of that is that you have defined what you need, right? Which is an important thing. What do you need? Like, what is sufficient, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do have a question about, you know, as a Black man, given your pedigree, the external pressure we're talking about. I mean, knowing some of my dear friends, I know some of my dear friends who are in similar positions as you feel a responsibility, maybe even a duty, to continue down that path because those are paths of influence, and they can help a whole lot of other people by doing that. Like our dear friend Justin, right?
I definitely do feel that like that pressure, especially realizing that there are a limited amount of Black people that end up with the opportunities that I have. So if I think about my HBS class, 930 people, 93 people per section. If I think about my section of 93, there's only 4 Black people in that section. So when you're looking at the numbers, you realize, okay, not a lot of people have ended up in the kind of seat that I have, and I've even had some mentors, and when I say mentors, people that have people that have given me guidance. And I think it's really important not just to have people that would support the decisions that I'm making, but also to have people that say, Triston, what the hell are you doing? And I think of one mentor of mine who works in the professional services space, earns millions a year. And I remember the first conversation that I had with him. He very clearly, when I was talking to him about my interests, and I said, okay, I have 2 core interests. My first core interest is, at an individual level, how do you help people reach their full potential? My second core interest is, at organizational level, how do you help companies create a culture where their employees are engaged? Now, this was kind of getting to the realization of being able to define what I was looking to do in two question statements. For me, was like felt like a milestone, and felt something that I was like really happy about. And I remember having this conversation with this person, and he was just listening to it all. And then he just started laughing, and he was like, you should go make some money. And he was like, all this stuff that you're doing doesn't really, like, at the end of the day, that the CEO and the investor, like, make the decisions. So he was like, and so, but you need that. I think I need, I don't just want a camp of people telling me to do the things that I'm inherently going to do because they feel right and they feel natural. Now, at the end of the day, I make my own decision. That's one person's data point. And ultimately, I've decided not to really act on that data point. But there are, aspects of what he was saying, right? So I don't let the initial misalignment between how he views life and how I view life mean that he has nothing of value to say. There's a tremendous amount of value to say. And so I picked on those kernels and so forth. But to your question, I think that there are different forms of impact. So I think people like Justin have a tremendous impact, without a doubt, for anybody who's like, Black and in the BCG community, and also just beyond the Black community at BCG, just as a leader of the firm, heading the Washington, D.C. office, being a leader within the energy practice, all the stuff that he does has a tremendous practice. And that's one sphere that he's able to have a practice, like an impact. And I would say I'm able to have an impact in another way, in a different way. I'd say there's 40 plus people that have tuned in today to listen to a conversation that hopefully they walk away with some perspectives. And I know for a lot of people, it might not be easy to get on the phone with, HBS alum, Kellogg alum, people that are in these types of opportunities and so forth. And so I feel like I'm able to have my impact in a different way. And I think that is okay, because I think that progress is going to need, for any cause, whether it's like, corporate diversity, progress is going to need champions from all corners. So progress is going to need people like Justin Dean, people like Carla Harris at Morgan Stanley. They're going to need the trailblazers who do create the path. But I also think that they're going to need people who have thought about it the way that I've thought about it, in the sense that, I'm able to have that proximity to people like Justin and to Carla, and to understand it. And then I'm able to make myself very readily available, and do certain things that if I stayed in a corporate path and became a senior executive in a corporate path, maybe I would have less time to do some of these things. And I feel like both of those things are needed to ultimately advance a cause. And so I stopped trying to think about it in terms of I need to be a senior executive so that I can have this impact, and started to think about it more like, again, what is the impact that I want to have, which I define as helping people reach their full potential at an individual level and helping companies create that culture. And I feel like I'm able to do that today and now, and I'm also learning as I do that, and I'm also growing as I do that. So I have a fair amount of confidence that I will still be able to eventually reach a level of influence that is comparable to these leaders that we're mentioning. I just think that my path there is going to look a little bit differently, and I think that that's what I've started to try and bring and give myself a little bit more comfort in. Prakash, I'd love to hear your perspectives on this conversation through the lens of some of the executives that you have worked with, because I know that people in their 20s and their 30s sometimes look at executives and feel as though that you've kind of reached this senior spot and now you found the holy grail and life is just fantastic and easy from this point on, when I'm sure there's a lot that these senior executives are really grappling with as well, and you've been able to work with them and coach them and so forth. So I'd love to hear any examples or things that you have learned from people and these senior executives around the different set of challenges and insecurities that they might face, even though externally people will just look at them as a success story over and over again.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to think of where to maybe start, and I want to be brief because I know it'd be useful to get to questions. I think the main message here, team, is like everybody you think has it made, they have some of the same narratives you have in your head. I talk to CEOs who tell me, Prakash, I'm a total fraud. I talk to people who sold a business for $1 billion and, now they're kind of figuring out what to do. They're like depressed, they're really not in a good place. I mean, not that I haven't talked to people who are very happy where they're at, but there's a number of people in positions that you admire today that that are saying some of the same narratives. I'm assuming, I don't know if there's a way to be interactive here on raising your hand, but like I would just wonder how many of you have a narrative of like, hey, man, I'm not smart enough, or oh, I didn't do this, I'm not good enough, or oh, I'm not strong at this one skill that everybody loves. Like, oh, I'm not good at math and everybody's good at math, or I'm not I just don't do politics or something like that. I'm assuming everyone has some form of narratives like that. I promise you, these are the same narratives that a lot of people at the top have too. The reason I mention that to you is like, if you think about it, we can't control outcomes, all right? We can't control outcomes. But what you do have an opportunity to do is to reshape some of the narrative that you have of your capabilities, of yourself, of your worth, of your ability to move forward. You are fully within control to change that narrative. And here's what normally happens. What normally happens is I beat myself up. And what I do is I start blaming it on all this. Oh, the politics of this company sucks. Oh, God, look at those people. They get up there because they went to the right schools. Oh, God, look at that. That's just like, that sucks, like totally against me. I'm not saying any of those things are true. But does it matter whether they're true? Like, the only thing that matters that is within your control is how you decide to think about yourself, to talk to yourself, to be more encouraging to yourself rather than discouraging. Look, you are wired to think negatively to a degree, as humans. Like, your brain is somewhat wired to do that. And so it's important for you to give yourself a fighting chance by thinking every day something as simple as, what am I proud of myself for and why? Like, what am I proud of myself, the things I've done? And you will see in a week, you will be like, wow, there's a lot that I do that I'm very proud of. And soon enough, you'll start talking about characteristics and not just accomplishments. My point in saying that is that, like, I really hope one of the things you're taking away is so many people that you think are in great places are not. It's kind of like it's like when you look on Facebook and everybody's life looks awesome. It's like they're dealing with the same crap you are, genuinely dealing with the same narratives, um, you know, and so your ability, the way you can be successful for yourself, I don't, maybe not, I don't know if you're gonna make millions of dollars or something, but like, is to change the narrative, right, of yourself and use that narrative when you engage other people, because others, it will receive that. No two ways about it. They will receive that, and they'll see the sort of the positivity that you're bringing. It sounds so simple and it sounds maybe abstract, but you'd be surprised at how much simply shifting your narrative can help. There's a guy named Jim Lair who wrote a book called Power of Story. I'd check that out. It's a interesting book about sort of what your current story is and how you change that story. I'll pause there, but
Yeah, no, I think this is a great place to pause, and I'd love to now turn it over to the Q&A. And Wenjin, I saw that you had your virtual hand raised earlier, so I'll start with you, and then if others have questions, please just raise your virtual hand so that I'm aware.
Thank you so much for the time. So my question is around kind of how you pivot from doing something singular to kind of what you do after you take a little bit more of the conventional path. And just to give a little bit of context, I graduated from Amherst College. I worked in entertainment. I knew that's what I wanted to do, figured out how to make it happen. And now I work at my family business, which has been going really well.
And I'm sorry, now you said you own your own business.
I work at my family business.
You work at your family. Okay.
Yeah, which has been a test case for how do you change the narrative and how do you take kind of extreme ownership. And I want to go back to the MBA to learn how to scale it, learn finance and strategy, but I don't want to get distracted by all the great opportunities that come from an MBA. I want to make sure that I stay focused on my end goal. So how
you want to make sure I didn't catch that last.
Apologize. I want to make sure that I stay focused on my end goal of scaling the family business. And don't get distracted by the fact that you can go into consulting, or you could like work in CPG for forever, or you could go do all these amazing things, right?
So your question is like, well, how do I stay focused on that? It's a great question. It's a great question. I guess the question I would actually ping back to you, which you don't have to answer right now, but is, why do you want to scale a family business? Because if your why is not strong enough, consulting and banking and all these other things will seem pretty great.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
why?
I'll toss it out there because I've been doing a lot of work on values, but for me, it's about wealth, impact, and ownership. And we're a CPG manufacturing business. And so if you can go to market and get nationwide, then you really have access to like major markets and to kind of changing the narrative around like what food systems look like. So that's my one.
Very cool. And I would, since you have been doing this reflection, I would suggest you actually keep going down like, okay, well, why does that matter? Wealth, impact, and affecting food systems. Why does that matter to you? Because I think what you really want to get to is the nugget that's like, this is so meaningful to me, and I know exactly why it's meaningful to me. So when you look at other things, it's just they don't hold a candle, because you're like, what's meaningful to me about that is I'll make a lot of money, and that's cool. But this is more meaningful in your heart, right? You're like, this is so meaningful to me, I want to do it. And so I think that the more you can excavate that, the higher the probability of you, keeping at bay. Not to say that you have to, but like it seems like that's a purpose for you to scale your family business.
Perfect. Thank you. Great answer.
Awesome. And thank you for the question.
Cool. Good luck.
Yeah. Kenneth, I'll turn it over to you, and then Charles, I'll turn it over to you after that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I guess the question that I have is, how do you find what's authentic to oneself, like amidst all the noise that you have from external sources? And I know that like Prakash and you mentioned how important reflection is. But I feel like it's not just about journaling. So I was wondering, what are some of the ways we can meaningfully figure out what's true to ourselves so that, when we make decisions, they can be genuine and authentic.
Tristan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess my initial reaction, one thing that I found particularly helpful is trusting my gut in terms of what experiences I actually enjoy and what experiences I don't enjoy. I remember early on in my career, one of the things, an exercise that I went through was actually retrospectively looking at my calendar and trying to remember what my emotional state was at that point in time. So if I see a dinner with somebody on my calendar, I see a lunch with somebody on my calendar, or I see a work meeting, asking myself, how was I feeling leading up to that? Was I excited that this thing was on my calendar, or was I kind of stressed that I would, had to do it and didn't actually want to do it, but felt obligated to do it? And I tried to remove as many of the things that I was doing out of a sense of obligation as opposed to doing out of a sense of I'm looking forward to this. And it's so clear, especially the things that I'm just very genuinely excited about, even if I'm like, yesterday I celebrated my dinner with two of my closest friends here in Singapore, and I just went over there to their home. And on my way there, that feeling of like genuine excitement to just sit on their couch is kind of like an indication that this is a good way for me to kind of spend my time versus I have other instances where maybe I'm going and it's coffee with a colleague or something that I'm doing out of a sense of like obligation as opposed to really genuinely enjoying it. And I think that I can apply that, and the more that I do that, the more that I'm ultimately able to remove the things off my plate that are inauthentic, which I think leaves me with a plate full of things that I much more authentically appreciate. And that's kind of been something that has helped guide me through that same journey and same question.
If I may, I would throw out, I imagine others would wonder this as well, because people talk about reflection. It's like, I don't know what that means. So I think there are a few different things that you can do. Number one, I think the mindset you have to go in with reflection is non-judgmental. Think about when you journal. I bet there's a whole lot of judging about yourself, about how you showed up in something, about what you did. There's a whole lot of judging. The problem with that is that it doesn't allow you to look at things from a distance and say, what do I really like? What do I not like? And where do I get in my own way? Right. And so I think if you want to start understanding what's authentic to yourself, I think there's a value in a few different little exercises. One is, at the end of the day, I would just write down all the events of the day. No judgment to them, just all the events of the day. Just what happened, right? Dropped off my kids at school, had breakfast, had a client meeting. I would look at that and then put right next to it, was I energized or de-energized, right? And you start seeing some themes incredibly quickly, like what energizes you. Now, I think for people, you know how they say, do what you love, right? Like, I think that's a bit of nonsense advice. Like, I think if you really want to find a passion, you have to know what intrinsically motivates you, but then you have to be validated for that. Like, I love singing. No one in their right mind would pay me to sing, like, so it doesn't really make sense that I'm going to do that as a profession. But if I really, doesn't mean I can't do it in the shower or at home, to my wife's like, poor ears. But I think you got to be able to look at like what you're doing that you genuinely are energized by, and then what do you get validated for? So Kenneth, if there's something you do that you find that you consistently get validated for, it will be interesting for you to know what you enjoy, because you can create a pretty virtuous cycle very quickly. In the next week, just pay attention. Pay attention to you. Pay attention to what others say to you. You will be amazed at how clear the signs are of what you're actually meant to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Thank you, Kenneth. Charles, I'll turn it over to you, and then Kim, I'll turn it over to you after that.
Awesome. Thank you, Tristan and Prakash, both for doing this, and happy birthday, Tristan.
Thank you.
I have two questions. The first is around mentorship. So Tristan, you mentioned a couple of mentors that you have, and some of them are very, very senior execs, right? I've heard in previous sessions, you also mentioned a point about which I agree with, but I'm still trying to come to terms of how to do. So that's what the question's around. But I've heard you mention like the importance of not only taking from those relationships in terms of guidance, advice, etc., but also adding value, providing something to those mentorship relationships over time. And so I was wondering if you could provide some examples on some ways you do that, right? I had this one mentor I met with this summer who very senior in the investment field, which is what I'm interested in, ended up writing a thank you note and sending him a tie with his company's logo, which apparently he always wears a tie with his company's logo. So did that. I think that was well received, but of course want to look for other ways to add value and provide back. And then the second question is around entrepreneurship. And Prakash, I understand you were involved in entrepreneurship, has coached entrepreneurs as well, but also went down the path of getting an MBA, something that's pretty expensive from a financial standpoint. I'm considering to go get an MBA. I also want to, or know that I'm going to run my own businesses. And so I'm looking to kind of understand how to balance, the risk of, starting your own businesses when you have financial responsibilities, maybe to yourself, to your family, and you aren't necessarily going to start out with the traditional benefits that you may get from going to work at a larger company.
Prakash, I'd love to maybe tackle the first and then turn it over to you to tackle the second. So Charles, just around the question in terms of adding value to the life of somebody who's a senior executive and maybe on the surface seems like there's nothing that you could possibly do to help them, or at least that's how I felt very early on in my career. What can I, as an analyst at Morgan Stanley, do to, support Carla Harris, who's a vice chairman at, Morgan Stanley, and presumably has a lot of resources to be able to do the things that I might be able to help her out with. And what I realized over time is that there's always, as long as you're able to get to know the person and understand what their priority is in life, not just their professional agenda, but what are they trying to accomplish with the impact of their life. If you can get good visibility into that, then you can think of ways to creatively support other people. And I think that when it comes to very senior executives, that creativity piece in terms of how you support them is actually really important, because you'll have to think and come up with your own solution for what you could do to add value, as opposed to, it's not like somebody that is a direct manager where you can just blatantly ask them, what initiatives are you working on that I can help with? And they'll give you a roadmap to what will be helpful for them. So with somebody, to make it a very concrete example, with somebody like a Carla Harris, she's really passionate. I mean, even in her bio, she puts, I have been blessed so that I can be a blessing to others. Like Carla Harris, she's on the board of directors of Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, the organization that Prakash and I have touched on a bit. And it's very clear that everything that Carla Harris does, there's part of her, which basically in the back of her head is, okay, how can I pay this forward? How can I help the next, generation of people? She lives by it. Now, what I was able to do, and again, this is just something that I was thought to myself, okay, what could I possibly do to help this person? First of all, I raised my hand to be the SEO firm captain for Morgan Stanley while I was there, which basically just meant there's about 40 or so summer interns at Morgan Stanley each year. And I was the point person for each of these SEO interns that would come, and I would meet with them one-on-one. I would organize them into groups of 10, and I would basically just prep them before. Carla Harris would try to meet with as many of these interns as possible during the actual summer internship, even though her, calendar is, extremely busy. She's often traveling, all of this different stuff. I would prep these SEO interns before they went into the meeting. So I would hold a meeting with them and I would say, look, here is everything that I know from, and for context at this point, I started off just, Carla was somebody that I would turn to advice for on a quarterly basis. Then I eventually ended up having the opportunity to work directly for her for about 2.5 years and reporting into her on that multicultural client strategies team. And through that, I picked up and I was able to say, okay, here are some initiatives that or here are some things about Carla that will just be helpful for you to know. First of all, like she really wants to help you very genuinely. So your biggest obstacle in the conversation with her is just going to be time. So like cut to the chase in many ways, give them that prep that they, I prep them and say, look, this is what I do. Like when I go and I meet with Carla, I print out a one-page piece of paper that's my agenda and I put that in front of me. So visibly she's able to see that I'm, really serious about this 30 minutes that I'm going to have with her, whatever it might be, walk them through the steps of how I would prepare for the meeting. And over time, Carla ended up actually, I never even told Carla that I was doing this. But over time, Carla eventually came up to me and she said, "You're prepping these interns, aren't?" She like stopped by my desk and she was like, "You're prepping these interns, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've been having conversations with them. I just want to make sure that they get as much as possible out of the conversation." And she's like, "I knew something was happening differently because there's no way that like we just all of a sudden started recruiting these, people that were just that much more prepared going into that conversation." So what I'm saying is she noticed the level of difference and she appreciated it because it allowed her to actually be much more impactful with her time. So she wants to give back, and me, basically prepping people allows those to be a more impactful conversation. So that's one example. Another example, Carla was working on a lot of initiatives for investing in multicultural owned companies. And I brought together, a group and we had a roundtable of women that had started businesses. And I organized this entire half day. And then all Carla had to do was basically or talk to this, group. And I was able to get like pretty prominent entrepreneurs into the room because I would reach out to them and I'd say, "Hey, I work with Carla and, she would love to be able to have this conversation. Do you think you could, get together a group of entrepreneurs and we make like a half day event out of it?" And then I made it, like basically a half day mini conference out of it. And I brought in other speakers from Morgan Stanley and all of this other stuff. But again, this was another thing that like, she wasn't necessarily telling me to do this. It was outside the context of what my role was at that point in time, but I just knew that it would be something that was important to her. And I think that I would try and focus on what does that person really want to accomplish with their life? What's the impact that they're looking to have? What's the energy they're looking to bring into the world? And then if there's something you can do to further that, they will appreciate it because everybody has the constraint in terms of time. So if you can do these things, you're helping them on that time constraint, which will be really valuable. And then the last thing I'd say on this subject is a lot of times when I was early in my career, I thought of myself as a burden when I was reaching out to these senior people. But what I started to realize more and more, and I start to realize that because even if I think about my own day when I'm in consulting as an example, if I have another 30-minute work meeting versus, there's one conversation peppered into the day where it's a 30-minute conversation from, a young, ambitious, aspiring person that wants to pose me a few questions, there's actually a lot of joy that 30-minute non-work related conversation brings. So I try to not think of it as a burden. And then I would just say, let the people who you're trying to, brighten their day, let them know that they are adding value. So I would say, or adding value and really making a big impact. So if it's, somebody, even, if I were to use Justin as an example, who we've talked about, Prakash, who I've met more recently through Justin, I think it's very clear to Prakash that like I appreciate his advice and his perspectives, and it's really forming the way that I think. Now, making that clear to the person it increases their level of motivation to continue doing it. So because I think I'm able to convey how impactful this is for me, that's a big part of the reason why somebody like Prakash would carve out time in order to have this this conversation. And so I think that just recognizing that when you're thoughtful and you're genuine and you're excited and you're eager and you're reaching out to somebody that's senior, you might actually be a very bright spot in their day or their week, as opposed to not thinking of yourself as a burden on their schedule. So I think that has been a big part of the way that I've thought about really practically trying to add value to some of these senior executives. Sorry, I was a bit longer-winded than I anticipated. I'll turn it over to you for the second question, Prakash. And
yeah, Charles, great questions. Just one note on what Tristan said, like that last part. I think a good question to ask yourself when you're dealing with these mentors, first of all, I think a good realization is to know that any senior exec has a calendar slew, like just filled with back-to-back meetings that ultimately get boring as all get out. And, you know, meeting you, like Tristan said, can be a shining part of the day. The other thing is, I think when you are reaching out to these people or trying to engage them, maybe instead of thinking about yourself, it's like, oh, why would they want to talk to me? Ask yourself, you know, what would make them want to talk to me? Like, what are all the reasons they would? And I promise you, if you start actually sitting down, there's a number of reasons they would. You know, I talk to senior execs all the time that are like, man, I'd love to get the ear of like a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old, because I have no clue what's going on, you know, day to day. Or I just talked to someone the other day who's like, my daughter is like 27, and honestly, I just don't understand her perspective. I need one of like somebody on our team to like help me understand her perspective. It's like, that's value. This person's kid. So now on entrepreneurship, I think what you had asked is like, you want to start something, you're thinking about business school, it's a steep cost, and you know, starting something when you are coming out of school with a financial burden, like what is that? Like how do you think about that? Is that right?
Right, that's right. What considerations would you give, and then as you move forward, how do you navigate it?
I think the first thing I would do is just understand your inherent nature. Like, I'll give you an example. I started my own business, but you know what? I made half of my LinkedIn salary while I was at LinkedIn, outside, like from outside sources, from like coaching clients outside of LinkedIn before I jumped. The reason is my inherent nature is not one to be like, I'm willing to just roll with it, right? Like that is not an inherent nature. Now I coupled that with the fact that I have two young kids, and you know, my wife does a great job. But like, you know, my tolerance for that ambiguity was not high, you know. And here too, I would really, really encourage you or anyone else who's thinking, just be honest with yourself. Like, don't lie to yourself. We are the biggest liars to ourselves. It's unbelievable. We lie to ourselves all the time, you know. Oh, I eat healthy, but I had a burger and fries yesterday, and you know, it's like, just be honest with yourself. And you can be honest with yourself if you don't judge yourself. Just be honest about it. Be honest about your inherent nature. I think the second thing I would ask you is like, not to be attached to the idea that you have to start a business. I think sometimes like we create an image of what it means to do that, or to be a partner at BCG, or so we create some like caricature of what that means. And we hold so strongly to it that like we eventually do it and we're kind of like, didn't really mean that much. So I would just, I think it's great to have the intention of it, and also don't be wed to it, right? Like there's a ton of opportunities that can come your way over time. B school is a lot of money. It's a lot. It's hard to quantify the value of it. I can honestly say, would I have gone again? I don't know. I mean, you know, it was great. I loved it, but can I say that I, you know, got, you know, 3x my, you know, investment? Like, no, I don't know. I have no clue. And so I think like accepting the fact that you won't have a clue on like how things will pan out there are important. But I think if you have, very similar to what we were saying with Wangin, is like, if you have a why of business school that really makes sense, you know, that you validated. When I say you validated, so I have friends who go to business school that'll say, I really want to just explore my options. But for any of us who've gone to business school, you realize week 2, there are recruiters from all these great companies. And so, like, are you really exploring? No, like by and large, unless you have a deep why, like Wang Yin will have, going to B school, you really won't. You won't do that. So be honest with yourself there too. It's like, uh, you know, uh, uh, why am I going there? And is that why? Can that pan out as a reality? Validate that. Call some people at the B school. I know I did that. Like before going to B school, I like looked up people at the business school. I just emailed them and I was like, hey, would you be open to talking? I don't know. Most people were. So I think like the net of that, Charles, is I couldn't tell you exactly what you would do, but I think a consideration is who are you? Get clear on what you value, right? And one thing you could do is just ask yourself. You go online. There's a values exercise. Just what are my values, right? And what does that mean? And then why do I want to go to business school? And being honest with myself, does that really make sense for where I want to go? And to be clear, as I had mentioned to Triston a while ago, we were talking about sort of like this very topic. For some people, it's like, I want to make an F ton of money. All right. I mean, like if you feel real strongly about that and that you have some reasons, and fine. I wouldn't judge yourself on that. Like that just is. It's okay. You may come to realize that you say, oh, well, actually, it's not as important as I thought. But hey, you feel that strongly right now. I wouldn't overthink. Just be honest with yourself and don't judge it. You know how people love to say like, oh, that person does all the good stuff. They're doing things like nonprofits and blah, 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 blah. I was like, well, so what? Somebody else like wants to make a lot of money and such is life. Nothing wrong with them because of that.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm mindful of time. Prakash, are you okay for another 5 or 10 minutes, just if we take the final few questions? If you had a hard stop, that's also perfectly fine as well. So maybe what we'll do is we'll aggregate all of the remaining questions, just so that we can get a sense of that. So Kim, I'll start with you, then Kari. Before we answer it, then I'll go over to Kari. You can pose your question, and anybody else on the line that has a question, we can gather all of them first, and then answer them after that. So Kim, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Triston, and happy belated birthday. I just wanted to say that you hosting these talks and stuff like that with no charges and just very inviting. I think that has an influence in my life as well. So I just want to say thank you and
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Prakash, moving on to the topic, since we're on creating your path versus choosing a predictable one. I hear you say deliberate 3 times. I think that's deliberate is creating your own path, and being intuitive is following the predictable one. Growing up in Asia, and I'm 25 years old, I would like to draw some of my personal experiences, which I've overcome, but I think I'm just interested to hear what you think about it. In Asia, understanding that the historical context where a lot of parents are migrants, and they came from hardship, a lot of them project onto their children. They apply these external pressure that we talked about, right? And this pushes a lot of kids to choosing careers that are, decided by their parents. Go be a doctor, these stereotypical Asian like parent thing. Doctor, engineer, right? Exactly. So that said, I just wanted to touch on things like specifically on people who are not able to choose their own path. They're given a predictable one and they can't get out of it. And I really want to try and understand how you advise someone to sort of blend that together, right?
Well, sorry, go ahead. You were finishing.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to just draw, which is that's the jobs part, and in some instances even pushing their children into family businesses, which is hard to get out. And in some sense, it's you're stuck with it, right? But Yeah.
So I love the question. If I may, I hope you don't feel offended by it, but you are always able to choose. The thing is, there are consequences to those choices. And so, I'll give you an example. One of my dear friends, physician, his parents like kind of really they were both physicians, pushed him into it. And for years, he's a cardiothoracic surgeon. And for years, he was like, I hate this. It's ridiculous. My parents pushed me into it. He had a whole narrative. Well, so I think at some point you got to ask yourself, are you willing to do something about that pressure coming at you? Are you willing to buck that? If you're not, then let's talk about how you make peace with it and find goodness in it and reframe to be more like, what am I doing that is of value? And in this person's case, he was like, look, I am helping people. And on the side, I'm learning things that I'm interested in, and that's fine. I also have a friend who was a surgeon who actually totally gave it up and ended up doing like a business that he wanted to. And he, comes from our backgrounds. But he had a consequence. His parents were angry for a while, and it's like he's a grown man, But culturally, that's how it is very much how our cultures operate. And like, I think to say that we aren't able to choose is a bit of a it's not meant. I know it's not what you meant, but it can feel like you're helpless. But you actually are very able to choose. What I actually more hear is that we won't choose to buck the trend because the consequences are too high for us. And so I think somewhere in there, you got to ask yourself, like, is that consequence worth it? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing is, and you're definitely right. I think that 100% everyone has a choice. It's just how you deal with the consequences. I think that it also, for example, if you had a family and you're working and your family is dependent on your income, you might not take that risk. And I think it's just understanding. Yeah, at that point, it's being content in some ways and having that gratitude of like where you are then and how you can add value as well.
Right, reframing what it is. I tell you what, there's too many that I think are like, oh, I hate this job and this sucks. And it's like, okay, well then you do have a choice. You don't have to be there. But clearly you are choosing to be there because it is the better alternative perhaps to something else, or you have another reflection to figure out what next. But, it's fully within your choice, right? So either reframe, make peace with what is, and move on, or you won't be very happy.
Great. Thank you, Prakash.
Thank you.
Hey. Thank you, Kim. Kari, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And Prakash, Tristan, thank you for hosting this. And Tristan, happy birthday. So I think my question is really around, in a lot of instances, it's relatively easy to select a path where you know that you're better at something than the alternative, even if there is like a financial reward that's at the other end of something that you're not necessarily good at. But then I think that the other question is just along the lines of like, what if you are good at one area and there is something that will, provide you with like mid to short term utility in terms of just like satisfaction. And then balancing that with like something that in the long term is probably going to provide you with better satisfaction, but in the short term requires like a lot of building blocks that are not exactly the most enjoyable in terms of building, but in the long term is kind of there. I think that those sorts of questions are even more difficult because there are, I think that it's a lot easier if it's something that you dread versus something that you love. But if it's something that you like versus something that you love, I think that there is like a little bit more apprehension in terms of like making that decision, because there are gains to be made either way. So how do you kind of like navigate those sorts of decisions?
And just so I understand the question, it sounds like you're saying there's an option to do something that you like, it's fine, it'll provide some short to midterm satisfaction, but not thrilled by it. And then there's something you really think could be really cool, but maybe you're not as good at.
Exactly, yeah. And then also, not only you're not as good at, but then it's gonna definitely like there are always elements of something that you're not gonna like, and it requires like the upfront sink of like, I think time that won't necessarily be the most enjoyable. And I think especially when you're younger in your career, like it's a little bit easier to kind of give into those temptations, so to speak.
And if you do, fine. I think, again, going back to non-judgment, it's okay. Like, make peace with it. It's okay. But also know if you don't, you do the other thing, you're going to have to work. And you're going to probably have to double time it versus what you would have done in that job that you liked that provided short to midterm gains. So going back to Long In, like, is your why big enough? Is it like that interesting to you? For me, coming into this business was that meaningful to me that I was willing to say, fine, I'm going to work as hard as I possibly can to make this a reality. But my why was interesting, but just accepting that, whichever choice you make is okay. Just make it conscious, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. You're welcome to say it. Absolutely not, Prakash. That sounded
no. I think it. No, I think it does. I think that often there is that like I would say like in immigrant culture in general, there is that, hey, just like hunker down and do it, and like your instincts are not going to guide you in the right direction. I think that is a different piece of advice than usually where we land.
We've lost the ability to trust ourselves. And then you compound that with the data-driven world that we're in, which is wonderful in so many ways. I mean, it allows us to validate, but instead of using the data to validate or disprove our own inherent understanding of ourselves, we use the data to tell us who we are. Oh man, it's brutal. Like you can't get out under that. Like we don't, you're not gonna be happy ever.
Yeah, like WebMDing like your own personality traits.
Right. That's right.
Great, thank you, Kari. Mehak, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. Happy birthday again, and Prakash, good to see you. Question I had, wanted to double click a little bit on your path to your latest chapter. Is when you went from the nonprofit / corporate world, let's call it a predictable path and career, into getting into what I would call a very crowded, very noisy, gray, some like the coaching industry, some don't, back and forth, I spend a little bit of time on Clubhouse just doing some interesting things, and there's a lot of coaches on Clubhouse, but I'm curious to know tactically and some of your experiences of going from Prakash corporate nonprofit typical predictable path to Prakash the coach to senior executive CEOs, and how you got even your first like startups, right? How you got your first couple of customers, clients. That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. One thing you'll learn about me is I don't really like when people speak to like linear narratives, like, oh, I came from like nothing and then I made myself into something. It's like I find most of those nonsense. Like you had a whole bunch of crap happen in between that you were unintentional about, and some things kind of happened your way and like went okay. And that's no different for me. So I wanted to do this work. I put my intention out there. Every single person I met, I would say, I want to get into some kind of coaching. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like, but that's what I want to do. And people started introducing me to their friends, and I was charging $50 a client, like something like that. But it was just to actually get something going. And when I went to LinkedIn, I did the exact same thing. I told everyone, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to do. I just had the good fortune in that sense that there was a guy that his name was Fred Kaufman. He was coaching our CEO. He ended up coaching the CEO of Google. And he was an economist by background, done a lot of organizational research, had a mindfulness bend, which I considered in my best days, I would love to emulate. And, he happened to literally be there. He was like probably the only person on the planet that was at a company like that was like at a reputable company in that kind of a position. It was like dumb luck. Now, I put the intention out there to say, hey, look, like, you got to take me on. And I just hounded him. And, but he was willing to receive that. So because of that, that got me from a place in which I would have just been scrounging. As you said, this is a crowded space. I would have been scrounging a lot to really get it off the ground well, at least financially well. But because of my support from him, I was able to work with a lot more people. And then about a year and a half before I was leaving, I knew I was going to leave. I was like, look, I want to make at least half my salary or half my all-in outside of LinkedIn. And, about a year or 15 months in, I probably made 2/3, 3/4, something like that. And I was like, okay, this seems reasonable. And I got my first client outside of LinkedIn through an exec at LinkedIn who was like, hey, no conflict of interest. Would you be willing to support a CEO of a company I invested in? And they're, sort of like on the path to being public in the next 12, 18 months, like this person scaling their leadership. And I took that person on and took some others on that really I found weren't a fit for me, but, learned along the way. So my point in saying that is I think the only thing I am in control of is putting my intention out there. I was not in control of the reception. But I think because I was genuine about it, I think it's something to ask ourselves, when we're thinking about all of us, like what we're doing and who we're trying to have as a mentor and stuff. Like, are you really, really genuine about this? Or is it like, it's just another stepping stone, which I know I've played that game too.
Awesome. No, thanks. That helps.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I see that there are no other hands that are up at this point. So I feel like we've cleared out the questions, but just wanted to really, again, say a very big thank you for dialing in. Prakash, thank you so much for carving out the time. Thank you, everybody, for the birthday wishes. This may feel like an odd way to celebrate the birthday to some, but for me, it really is a perfect way to celebrate. So it's been great. And I appreciate everybody being a part of that and joining for this conversation. As always, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Prakash, I assume it's okay if people send you a message on LinkedIn as well. Please do feel free to reach out to us, and I'll continue to host these.
I'd be slow to respond. I actually am on a schedule of looking at LinkedIn. Otherwise, I'll just sit on there forever.
Really appreciate everybody dialing in. And as always, I'll continue to host these events every month or so, a couple of times a month. And yeah, with that, I'll close here. And as always, after I close, I'll have office hours. So I'll just stick around if there are other things not related to the topic that people wanted to ask me. I'll stick around for as long as hopefully as long as, and be able to get to as many of those as possible. So Prakash, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the work you're doing here. You get wonderful people, and thank you to all of you who joined. I hope it was of value for you.
Thank you. All right, take care. Hey, Mom.
Hey, I hope.
Oh, you have a wonderful son.
I hope everyone here will indulge me. I know you've all wished him a happy birthday, but I'm his mom, so he has to take this. Happy birthday
To you.
Happy
Happy
birthday.
birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Tristan. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you, Mom.
Ms. Francis, you have a wonderful son.
I do,
I'm
I
sure you
know.
already know
Thank you
that.
so much. I know. And thank you all. I think it's wonderful what all of you are doing. As somebody who's retired and is kind of not dealing with all this stuff anymore, it's really beautiful to hear people talking about knowing what they really want, what they love, knowing themselves, being their authentic selves. Because when I was 30, nobody was talking about that. So it feels very hopeful to me to see this kind of thing going on. And I commend all of you.